All right, welcome, and thank you for joining us for the second lecture of three for this semester's series of lectures on the history and legacy of Black entrepreneurship in the United States, hosted by Princeton University's Keller Center. We started this series in the spring of 2021 and are thrilled to be continuing it. I'm excited to tell you about this series first, and then I'll introduce you to our amazing speaker, historian Dr. Brandon Winford from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. My name is Isam Beezer, and I'm a University Administrative Fellow hosted by the Keller Center and a PhD candidate at Rutgers Business School, where I study entrepreneurship from both contemporary and historical perspectives. The center's mission is to arm our community with the intellectual foundation, innovation skills, and networks to propel positive and sustainable societal impact. As a center, we recognize the pervasive and systemic racial inequality in our country and how this is deeply linked to many of our country's most profound challenges. We understand how important it is that our community has an understanding of these systemic inequalities as we work to solve some of humanity's most pressing challenges. And this brings me to our series of lectures. For all interested in innovation and entrepreneurship, much can be learned from the entrepreneurs who have succeeded under some of the most daunting constraints. At the end of the day, this is really at the core of entrepreneurship, no matter the context. Assembling limited resources for impact, Black innovators and entrepreneurs have overcome restrictive markets, segregation, Jim Crow laws, lack of access to capital, threats of violence and death, threat of intellectual capital theft, and many other extreme challenges. Yet still they thrived. These entrepreneurs have created innovations that have resulted in lasting societal and cultural changes far beyond the Black community. By exploring the history of Black entrepreneurship and innovation, we want to learn from the creative strategies Black entrepreneurs employed to succeed. At the same time, we want to explore how the constraints on Black entrepreneurship and business development have limited the overall economics, not of the Black community, but of our society as a whole, and how so many of these constraints have become institutionalized, and most importantly, how it can be overcome in the future. This exciting series of talks brings together scholars and academics from numerous institutions around the country to share their work in a discussion-based forum. Today, the title of Dr. Winford's talk is Black Business Activism in the Mid-20th Century South. But before I hand the room to today's scholar, please put your questions in the Q&A box. And if we have time at the end, which I think that we will, I'll ask your questions. So please do not be shy. Share your questions, your comments. This is really should be interactive, okay? So quick bio for Dr. Winford. He has a very long bio, so I'll just share a little piece of it, but please look him up and his work. It's remarkable stuff that he's doing. Dr. Winford is an associate professor of history at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. He's a historian of late 19th and 20th century United States and African-American history, with areas of specialization in civil rights and Black business history. He's the author of John Hervey Wheeler, Black Banking and the Economic Struggle for Civil Rights. He's from Morrisville, North Carolina, and received his BA and MA in history from North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina, and his PhD in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Fellow Tar Heel, yay. Professor Winford is the co-founder of the Fleming Morrow Endowment in African-American history, and is named after two pioneering Black professors at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, College of Arts and Sciences. So without further ado, I pass it to you, Dr. Winford. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Isan. If one of the panelists in the chat box would let me know if everyone can see the slide, and if you can hear me okay, just say everything's okay.
Everything's okay.
Okay, thank you. All right, so good afternoon. Hope everybody is doing well. Thank you all for the invitation to participate as part of the Keller Center's History and Legacy of Black Entrepreneurship in the United States series. I'm so happy to be here. Today, I'm titled my talk, Black Business Activism in the Mid-20th Century South, and it's grounded in my first book, John Hervey Wheeler, Black Banking and Economic Struggle for Civil Rights. So What I'm going to be talking about is really sort of part and parcel of some of the material and content from the book. And then there's some material that is just not in the book, it's just kind of in working stage that really sort of deals with this idea of African-American business abroad. It looks at John Hervey Wheeler in more of a sort of the Cold War diplomacy. So I'll talk a little bit about that kind of in the middle of my talk. But I hope to begin with just giving you a brief overview of my first book. Then I want to introduce you to John Hervey Wheeler, who is the main subject of that book. And then I want to discuss to some degree John Wheeler's idea of Black business activism, really looking at John Hervey Wheeler's work through or with the Kennedy administration during the 1960s. And of course, I look forward to the Q&A afterwards. The book is the first study about one of the leading Black business people and civil rights leaders in North Carolina, in one of the United States' most well-known Black Wall Streets. We rarely get a glimpse of what Black business in these places actually looked like after World War II. And so here in this book, we see how these leaders actually envision the continuation of Black business and Black institutions in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, which reveals why they embraced the Black freedom struggle to begin with. Second, the book is also grounded in new archival research from the John Hervey Wheeler collection, housed at the Atlanta University Center Robert W. Woodruff Library in Atlanta, Georgia. Third, the book explores the role of Black business people and shows exactly why someone like Wheeler became involved in the Black freedom struggle, despite all signs pointing to the possible demise of these institutions with the coming of integration. This also challenges previously held ideas and myths that Black business people rejected integration because it threatened their own success. To the contrary, because they didn't have an exclusive clientele in Black customers, they believed their businesses would expand and thrive even more if they had complete access to the larger marketplace. And finally, the book provides a behind-the-scenes kind of perspective of Black leadership. In this case, we're looking at a Black business leader that actually played a monumental role in the Black freedom struggle on a larger scale than we tend to believe. This is someone who had standing with the national civil rights leaders and was himself the president of a leading civil rights organization in the South, the Southern Regional Council, which he led from 1964 to 1969. And I should add that the Southern Regional Council had its origins in Durham, North Carolina, on the campus of North Carolina Central University, my alma mater, in October 1942, in what was dubbed the Durham Conference. It led to the organization's establishment in 1944. So John Wheeler had legal, political, and economic expertise that he used to shape the region's future and sought to make New South prosperity, this idea of New South prosperity, possible on a larger scale through seeing that every Southerner had an opportunity to make sure the region would prosper, grow, and survive amid the turmoil of the 1960s and beyond. And more recently, as of October 15, 2019, the federal courthouse on Chapel Hill Street in Durham was officially renamed the John Hervey Wheeler United States Courthouse. This picture in the top left, you'll see the gentleman to the far right beside this lovely woman in the gold is Congressman G.K. Butterfield from Durham, who introduced this legislation to rename the John Hervey Wheeler Courthouse. Butterfield was a mentee to John Hervey Wheeler. The right picture is a picture of myself with John Wheeler's children, Warren Hervey Wheeler and Julia Taylor Wheeler. And at the bottom, you can kind of get a sense of what that ceremony was about. Also included speakers like Vernon Jordan, who's one of the folks who endorsed or gave the blurb to my book, has since passed, who was also a mentee to John Hervey Wheeler. All right, so what's John Hervey Wheeler's relationship to Black business before he comes to work for the Mechanics and Farmers Bank in 1929? Well, you might say John Wheeler was born into Black business on New Year's Day, 1908. Interestingly, he was born the same year that the Mechanics and Farmers Bank opened. His parents, John Leonidas and Margaret Hervey Wheeler, they moved the family to Durham that summer when John Leonidas accepted a position as an insurance agent with the North Carolina Mutual and Provident Association. Now the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, soon to, it has recently reached kind of an era because the company is no longer going to be in operation as of this fall. Between 1898 and 1908, the Wheelers were educators and taught at Kittrell College in Kittrell, North Carolina, a school that was founded by the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Margaret Hervey taught sewing in the industrial department and would have also had a hand in training the women students in the ideals of Black womanhood that was espoused by Kittrell College and the AME Church. By 1908, John Leonidas also became president of Kittrell College. While in Kittrell, John Leonidas dabbled in business. He and John R. Hawkins, the education secretary for the AME Church, started the American Union Industrial Company and the American Union Benefit Association. So he kind of has this kind of connection to business already before he comes to Durham. Hawkins later becomes one of the founders of the Industrial Bank of Washington, D.C., which started in 1934, or the predecessor, I should say, to the Industrial Bank of Washington, D.C. John Leonidas' educator colleagues believe him to be foolish to have left the education profession for what they believe to be a corrupt field of business. John Leonidas began his career with the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company in July 1908, around his 39th birthday. While the family lived in Durham, John Leonidas worked in the North Carolina Mutual's Raleigh office until he began called to work in the home office as a bookkeeper. At the time John Leonidas began his work for the North Carolina Mutual, the insurance company neared its 10th year in operation. Its premium income in 1909 was $220,000. It had admitted assets of nearly $73,000 and insurance in force of over $1.5 million. The Wheeler family stayed in Durham for the next 4 years, at which point John Leonidas received a promotion. In 1912, they moved to Atlanta, Georgia, where he took over the Atlanta office of the North Carolina Mutual. The North Carolina Mutual's Atlanta office was located on Sweet Auburn Avenue, right, which was the commercial hub of Black Atlanta. The North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company entered Georgia the year before in 1911. So John Hervey Wheeler had kind of a front row seat when it came to Black business. And in many ways, this really explains his understanding of the importance of full citizenship to Black economic life. The Wheeler family regularly hosted John Leonidas' business associates in their home, especially the founders of North Carolina Mutual, people like John Merrick and Dr. Aaron McDuffie Moore. And it was, according to John Hervey Wheeler, he said, quote, although he was a man of few words, Dr. Moore's brain appeared to be a constant beehive of activity, and his personality indicated constant searching for truth and for new and better ways of doing things. For a youngster 10 years old, these experiences left upon me a lasting impression of the all-inclusive manner in which Mr. Merrick and Dr. Moore worked so hard to place the company on a firm footing, unquote. The two men, he said, quote, were in every sense of the word social engineers possessed with a oneness of purpose and exercised a strong influence upon my life as well as upon the lives of countless others. So John Hervey Wheeler and his two sisters, he had an older sister, Ruth Hervey Wheeler, and a younger sister, Marjorie Janice Wheeler. They came of age in Jim Crow Atlanta, Georgia. Wheeler often said that he, quote, started off life even from an economic standpoint. And this was true as the Wheeler children attended Atlanta public schools until the 7th grade, because there was no public school for Black Atlantans beyond 7th grade until 1924, when the city built Booker T. Washington High School. However, African Americans whose families could afford it, attended the city's private historically Black colleges and universities. Many of these educational institutions had academies or high schools as part of their educational offerings. In this way, John Hervey Wheeler attended Morehouse Academy, the secondary department at Morehouse College. Then he continued on as a student in the college department. At Morehouse College, John Hervey Wheeler majored in business, even as his true passion was playing the violin. There is one story during these years when the Wheelers' neighborhood caught fire, and all John Wheeler could do was stand helplessly by in front of their house and hold tightly to his violin. He played first violin with the Morehouse College Glee Club and Orchestra. He later credited his music professor, Kemper Harold, for the, quote, discipline which you instilled in me and your effort to impress upon me the great value of thoroughness have been among my most valued possessions. I have consciously found myself avoiding the pitfalls of doing things in a slipshod or casual manner, unquote. As a student at Morehouse College, too, John Wheeler joined the student newspaper, the Maroon Tiger, as an editor, as an assistant editor, and wrote articles that hinted at his developing worldview. He wrote about the New Negro movement, college students and their relationship to religion, and he also provided cultural observations, and this also included observations about the poets Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen. John Hervey Wheeler's business professors at Morehouse College included people like Lorimer D. Milton and Jesse B. Blayton, who taught him economics and accounting respectively. And they also were instrumental in terms of being officers of what became the Citizens Trust Bank in Atlanta. As a matter of fact, after John Wheeler graduated from Morehouse College in 1929, both Milton and Blayton want John Wheeler to come and work for the Citizens Trust Bank. Blayton actually became the first Black certified accountant in the United States. The American South had over 50 Black-owned banks in 1910. The number of Black banks fluctuated from between 50 to 70 financial institutions between this period in the late 19th century through about 1934. There were 50 to 70 financial institutions in operation at any given time. The Mechanics and Farmers Bank received its charter in February 1907, but it began operations a year later in August 1908 with about $10,000 in capital stock. The Mechanics and Farmers Bank had promised from the outset with significant support from the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, the North Carolina Mutual and Provident Association, which changed its name to the NC Mutual Life Insurance Company in 1919. By the time the Mechanics and Farmers Bank officially received its charter, the North Carolina Mutual's premium income had reached over $100,000, and the company could boast for being, quote, planted on a firm basis. And later, its kind of official tagline was that it was the largest Black-owned company in the world. And certainly it was the largest Black-owned insurance company in the United States. The two financial institutions operated from the same headquarters and had interlocking boards of directors, officers, and employees from the very beginning. By 1923, the Durham Bank also ventured into branch banking when it opened the Mechanics and Farmers Bank Raleigh branch at 13 East Hargett Street, becoming the only Black bank in the United States at the time with a separate branch. Although branch banking for African-American banks had gone all the way back to the Alabama Penny Savings Bank, which had two branches, one in Anniston, Alabama, and another in Montgomery. Its main bank was in Birmingham. Charles R. Frazier became the cashier of the Mechanics and Farmers Bank Raleigh branch, while James Edgar Strickland became an assistant cashier and bookkeeper. Dr. Aaron McDuffie Moore, the North Carolina Mutual president at the time, and Mechanics and Farmers Bank's second vice president, he warned Frazier that, quote, for the next 10 years, we are going to work the devil out of you, unquote. And so between 1908 and 1928, the Mechanics and Farmers Bank's resources grew steadily with notable outcomes from $20,000 as of 1908 to $758,000 as of December 31st, 1928. This image here is of the lobby of the North Carolina Mutual's building. On that first floor, the Mechanics and Farmers Bank operated on that entire first floor, which you see pictured here. And I kind of like this picture, and it kind of points to my current book project. If you look at this picture, you can see to the left, you can see the Black professionals, those bankers behind the teller cages. In the middle aisle, if you look to those two women in the back, they're dressed in maids uniforms. And this gentleman in the front is dressed as a mechanic overalls. And to the right, you can see the officers kind of contemplating and thinking about high order kind of business. And I really sort of like this image because it speaks to how we might think about Black banking and really trying to understand the Black bank as a site of Black economic life. And it gives us an opportunity to sort of think about the community dynamics that are at play inside the bank lobby, which is something that we can, as an extension we can sort of think about how that played out within the Durham community and so many other places where there were Black banks operating in the South. John Hervey Wheeler worked his way up by the early 1930s. He is the assistant cashier at the bank. By 1940, he is the cashier. 1944, he becomes the executive vice president and cashier at the Mechanics and Farmers Bank. Have a few more images. This is I showed you the Raleigh branch of the Mechanics and Farmers Bank. This is aside from the North Carolina Mutual building where the headquarters was, this is the Fayetteville Street branch of the Mechanics and Farmers Bank, one of the first locations where the bank sort of operated in what was the Hayti neighborhood, which is the largest Black neighborhood in Durham. And this opened up in 1954. By 1962, the bank opens up a branch on Beatties Ford Road in Charlotte, North Carolina, right adjacent to what is now Johnson C. Smith University, still has the branch location there. And so really the mid 20th century South, by the 1960s, the Mechanics and Farmers Bank as a financial institution, among the top 5 African-American owned banks in the country, and is steadily expanding in North Carolina and going into places like Charlotte, where by the late 1960s, Charlotte is on the cusp of becoming this significant financial center. Right today, it's one of the top 3 financial centers in the country, next to New York and San Francisco. So the Mechanics and Farmers Bank in Durham it kind of had this sort of role as a financial capital for Black America well before we see the likes of Charlotte, North Carolina coming into the fold as this significant financial center. And so John Hervey Wheeler is working with Mechanics and Farmers Bank. During the 1930s, he comes into an environment that has really sort of set up for what I like to sort of look at is this sort of training ground for Black business activism, right? These bankers or civic leaders, they're key people in the community. And so it's during the 1930s that John Wheeler has is kind of observing his immediate supervisors at the bank in community activism and civil rights involvement. But aside from the Mechanics and Farmers Bank, because of its sort of limited capacity to sort of address on a larger scale issues of civil rights, Black leaders in Durham, by 1935, they formed this organization called the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs. The Durham Committee on Negro Affairs, when it gets its start, John Wheeler, again, is kind of a Black business activist in training. Within a decade, that organization becomes part of John Wheeler's rising political clout, which was made possible through the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs, established in August 1935. That organization was interested in full citizenship for Black Durham, things like educational equality, police brutality, government employment for African Americans, voting rights, and public accommodations. During World War II, John Wheeler became the Durham Committee's Education Committee chairman. During that time, he also attended law school between 1943 and 1947. He becomes Education Committee chairman. He keeps the improvement of Black schools in Durham at the forefront of conversations within the Durham Committee and presses city leaders to ensure Black educational equality. So much so that by May 1949, he and others filed a lawsuit against the Durham City School Board in the case of Blue versus the Durham Public School District, case in which they win by 1951. This case was brought on behalf of 60 Black students and their parents. It aided in this legal fight, or John Wheeler was aided in this legal fight by a guy by the name of M. Hugh Thompson, and also the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund lawyers, people like Oliver W. Hill. If you look at this image to the bottom left, you see Oliver W. Hill and Martin A. Martin. And they won this case on the grounds that, quote, plaintiffs have been and are discriminated against on the account of their race and that they are entitled to injunctive relief. Blue became the first successful school legalization case in North Carolina, although there have been a few other cases that sort of got their start. by the 1950s, as a result of his litigating this case, John Wheeler almost becomes the first Black school board member. And I should note that had the Durham School Board appealed the decision up to the North Carolina Supreme Court, it is argued that blue would have become one of the cases that was consolidated as part of the consolidated cases as part of Brown v. Board of Education. Interestingly enough, the very next case that Oliver W. Hill and Martin A. Martin of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, the very next case that they handled is the court case in Prince Edward County, Virginia, which becomes one of the cases that makes its way up to the Supreme Court as part of the 5 consolidated cases as part of Brown v. Board of Education, right? And so the argument is that had the local school board appealed that case, it might have made its way all the way up. So after litigating this case, John Wheeler, and particularly after the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, John Wheeler becomes a spokesman for Black North Carolinians, especially on the issue of educational equality. He believed that Black citizenship was necessary for Black economic power, which would ultimately help the South move ahead economically. He and others argued for the immediate implementation of Brown. He appeared before the North Carolina governor and the state legislature as early as February 1955, arguing connection between an end to school segregation and economics. He asked them to remove the quote unquote shackles of segregation. And he used this appearance to encourage other North Carolinians and organizations to do more about bringing about desegregation in North Carolina. Made little headway with the public school legislation, but continued to advocate on the local level. John Wheeler becomes, in addition to his work on the local level with secondary education, he becomes one of the lawyers that argued Fraser v. Board of Trustees of the University of North Carolina, case is decided in 1956 before the U.S. Supreme Court. This case led to the first 3 Black undergraduates at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. John Wheeler, during the 1950s, appeared several more times before the North Carolina General Assembly during the 1950s. Again, making the correlation between education and equal employment, civil rights, and Black economic power. He becomes the chairman of the Durham Committee in 1957, a position he holds until 1978 at the time of his death. And so John Wheeler was very much a part of the traditional Black leadership, right, which still operated within established channels. And so what that means is that there were significant limitations to his leadership. John Wheeler was often criticized for wanting more power, right? And it was said that he used his leverage as a bank president to, in some ways, flex his muscle, where he threatened not to give loans to people that opposed him on certain issues, right? So we can see as a banker, it's often said that the banker is a key man in the community. The banker oftentimes holds the money bags, right? And someone in Wheeler's position was a kind of broker, a power broker within that context. Okay, I'm going to kind of transition to getting us thinking about, so by the 1960s, John Wheeler is at the height of his leadership. He's one of the most influential Black power brokers in North Carolina, among the top civil rights figures in the South during this particular time. He uses his growing political influence, his growing business influence as a way to influence public policy on a national level, especially as related to equal employment and voting rights for African Americans. But also during this time, John Wheeler it gives us also a look at how African American business leaders also positioned themselves during the Cold War, right? And so I often sort of talk about John Wheeler from the perspective, and others from the perspective of African American business abroad, thinking about the ways in which he used his position domestically to engage Cold War diplomacy. In November 1950, John Wheeler traveled to South Africa as one of 7 American fellows with the United States South Africa Leader Exchange Program. That program was a private nonprofit organization established in 1958. It was sponsored by the African American Institute with funding provided by individual and corporate donors from the United States and South Africa. The organization's purpose was to help in, quote, understanding between South Africa and American professional, business, and civic leaders, with the added bonus of fostering closer relations between the people of the United States and the continent of Africa more broadly. Wheeler was the only businessman in the American delegation, and he received the courtesies reserved for a foreign diplomat. Yet he was well aware of the country's system of apartheid and made clear he would not participate on a second-class citizenship basis. So John Wheeler and other Black business people from Durham, from North Carolina's Black Wall Street, they participated in Cold War diplomacy during the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson administrations. And most often, during this period when American presidents, especially Kennedy, are trying to court these African nationalists, right, in this sort of Cold War battle between the Soviet Union and the United States, when they bring African diplomats to the United States, oftentimes they brought them to places like Durham and Atlanta to show them that African Americans in the United States were successful, right? And they use these examples of Black business success in the United States to give these leaders a sense of the ways in which democracy, despite all of what they heard, democracy for African Americans was possible. And oftentimes these delegates were able to come to the North Carolina Mutual's home office. They often did a tour. The president of the North Carolina Mutual and employees welcomed them in the auditorium of North Carolina Mutual. They also helped facilitate state dinners with the governor of North Carolina, other political heavyweights. And so I have a few images that I'll sort of just walk through really quickly. This is an image of Sekou Touré, the first president of Guinea, during an official visit to the United States in October 1959. John Wheeler is welcoming the president to Durham. There is a big kind of celebration. Asa T. Spalding, who at the time is the president of the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, speech where he says that the North Carolina Mutual kind of has this kind of kindred spirit or relationship with Guinea, right? In the terms of they had a similar sort of challenge in terms of making their way to success. And he pointed to ideals of democracy and how the North Carolina Mutual Life as an African-American company was able to make its way in the United States. And so in many ways, Spalding is encouraging a kind of relationship between these African countries and the United States. This is a picture of a group of African-American businessmen who come to Washington, D.C. to the Ghanaian embassy to basically discuss some possible investments in Ghana. You can't really see here, or I don't really have time to go through it, but sitting down in the chair is Asa T. Spalding to the left, John Wheeler to the right, and the ambassador of Ghana in the middle. Some of the other Black businessmen who are pictured here is A.G. Gaston, who was a prominent Black businessman in Birmingham, Alabama. You also see John H. Johnson, who was the editor of Ebony Magazine and Jet Magazine, this sort of powerhouse media conglomerate. And so again, this gives us a sense of during the Cold War, African-American business people are brought in oftentimes by the Commerce Department and the State Department to really give these African diplomats some kind of sense of what was possible with their relationship with the United States. Picture of John Wheeler and the Ghanaian ambassador. This is a kind of, this is actually in Durham, where you have some representatives of Ghana who kind of visit Durham, and they have this exhibit. And so there's this kind of appeal and kind of a show of what's possible, right, by them coming to Durham. This is a picture of the premier of the Republic of Congo. This is early 1960s, who comes to Durham again for the same kind of purposes. He's meeting here with the mayor of Durham, some other Black business people and leaders in Durham during this particular time. All right, during the 1960s, again, the Mechanics and Farmers Bank, President John Wheeler, again, he's also representing the state and commerce departments, not just domestically, but he's representing them abroad, right? He goes on several trips. In 1963, for example, he traveled to Northern Africa for the International Trade Fair in Tripoli, Libya. And that same year, John Kennedy actually considers John Hervey Wheeler for an appointment as ambassador to Nigeria. In 1964, he served as a member of the Marshall Team in West Germany. In 1966, he lectured on behalf of the State Department in Egypt, Syria, and Cyprus. And so there's this broader conversation to be had about the role of Black businessmen and business people abroad, particularly during the Cold War, right? In 1959, 1966, again, he visited South Africa as part of this exchange program. These kinds of opportunities give them a kind of opportunity to represent the United States abroad. Also gives John Wheeler and others a unique window into foreign diplomacy, and an interesting position when one considers this idea of Cold War civil rights. The banker often articulated and represented the African-American businessmen's responsibilities abroad in a diplomatic capacity, but he also holds tightly again to the United States' foreign policy stance, while at the same time arguing for racial equality and economic justice on the domestic front. And of course, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union after World War II really sets the stage for the battlegrounds in the fight for global dominance. These two superpowers look to solidify their differing ideologies, with democracy and capitalism on the one hand and socialism and communism on the other. In the next decade, in the 1960s or 50s and 60s, the United States sought to expand its influence into the newly independent nations in post-colonial Africa, Asia, and Latin America. As the United States endeavored to fortify various relationships in pursuit of new allegiances, African-American business offered up, again, new outlets of goodwill that served the nation's foreign policy interests in complicated and nuanced ways. By the start of the 1960s, a few significant things happened that turned the tide as it relates to the civil rights movement. February 1st, 1960, Greensboro, North Carolina. In Greensboro, North Carolina, there was a sit-in that started at lunch counters. In Durham, a week later, on February 8th, 1960s, students began sit-ins in Durham. This also coincides that year with a gubernatorial election in North Carolina, and of course, the broader presidential election, where we see John Wheeler making a stance unlike one's or like stances he had made before, when he was really focused on the legal strategy and kind of focused on negotiation and brokering with white power structure. During the sit-in movement, we see John Wheeler continue to sort of operate and kind of use the sit-in movement as leverage, but he makes it clear that the students were leading this grassroots movement and was often criticized and challenged by the white power structure because he was unwilling to speak on behalf of the students, lent the students his wholesale support of the direct action of the sit-in movement in ways that he had never done before 1960. Later, John Hervey Wheeler is, by March 1961, when Kennedy becomes president, John Wheeler is appointed to the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. This executive order that is signed in March 1961 by President Kennedy that was going to, quote, ensure that Americans of all colors and beliefs would have equal access to employment within the government and with those who did business with the government. He appointed John Hervey Wheeler to the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. And real quickly, John Wheeler uses this position to keep pressure on the North Carolina governor to expand employment opportunities for African Americans. He uses this to have a voice in high-level decision-making, to influence the scope and focus of the President's Committee and its emphasis on equal employment and public policy on a broader level. He seeks Black appointments with the Kennedy administration, also keeps the lines of communication open with the state and National Democratic Party, and wants the party to show African Americans that they are the party for them. He's involved in appointments from the Kennedy administration to the U.S. Attorney for the Middle District of North Carolina, a guy by the name of Henry Fry, who becomes one of the first African American Supreme Court justices in North Carolina. And so John Wheeler, as this Black business activist, really uses his position as his banker, as a civil rights lawyer, to really sort of impact civil rights issue on a larger scale, because he really believed that African Americans had to have full citizenship rights as a way to obtain Black economic power, as a pathway ultimately to this idea of New South prosperity. It wasn't just about African Americans, but was about the prosperity of the South. I'm running out of time, but I'll just sort of end with getting you to think about sort of where I've taken this particular research, and I'm now focused on a book called Our Good Fortune: A History of Black Banking in the American South. Is really going to take a look at the ways in which the Black Bank was a site of we can look at the Black Bank as a site of Black economic life. This book really is going to argue that the everyday activities and rhythms inside the bank have not always been recognized for what they might tell us about community. Nevertheless, it became an important space where race, class, gender, institution building, and reciprocity regularly played out. I'll end right there, and I welcome questions from the audience.
Thank you, Dr. Winford. You provided such an insightful and important talk. When did Mr. Wheeler sleep? That's seems like a very busy man. So thank you for bringing him to us and painting a very vivid picture of what's going on during these times. We have a few questions, so thank you for saving some time for us. So we have one from our own Dr. From Cornelia, Executive Director of Keller Center. She said she appreciates showing the picture of the bank, the one with the people in line and the different areas. In what way do you think supplementing historical storytelling with images is essential to conveying a complete picture, especially to lay audiences?
Thank you for that question. So I did show a picture of North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company's building, right? It completes this building in 1921. At that time, it is like the second largest or second tallest building in Durham. One of the things that we have to sort of understand is when I talk about the Black Bank as a site of Black economic life, it was an important physical space for African Americans, particularly in places like Durham. The building itself meant something in terms of how African Americans themselves understood things like race pride. The building itself also held significance because it's also a center of, in Durham in particular, and representative of the Black Wall Street, right? It held not only the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company and Mechanics and Farmers Bank, but it's also the Mutual Building and Loan Association, the Bankers Fire Insurance Company. In this one building housed four of the major financial institutions in Durham and among the major financial institutions in the South. And so these physical buildings and spaces and the images are important because it gives us a sense of what was happening in terms of, I like to look at them because I'm really sort of interested in how community dynamics play out, right? What do we know about things like tragedy that happens in the bank, right? What do we know about the success, the challenges of the bank by sort of thinking about these images? These images also, kind of to just sort of put a bookend on it, these images also gives us a glimpse into spaces that, from a contemporary standpoint, in terms of the landscape, are in many ways no longer visible, right? We think about sort of these Black Wall Streets, and particularly these major Black sections, residential and business sections of these major cities: Durham, Richmond, Atlanta, Nashville, Memphis, New Orleans, Miami. In many ways, they're no longer there as a result of urban renewal. I write about urban renewal in my book. And so it's also important because these images allow us to get a broader sense of what was there. So when we're having this conversation about, and from a nostalgic standpoint, about how grand and how these communities thrive, and we go there now, and some of that is not present, and we're kind of like, well, where was this? We can use these images to really sort of recapture that landscape and really have a better understanding of the magnitude and impact that these institutions had in these Black communities. Great question. Thank you for that.
Thank you. It's also great to like humanize. It's always wonderful seeing people from back then and seeing how similar or different they are, dressed and look and everything. Another question we have a bunch of questions that are rolling in. How can we get this essential piece of American and entrepreneurial history into the public conversation and public schools history programs? And any thoughts on that, Doctor?
Yeah, it's a really, really great question. A challenging one. I think part of the way that we can approach kind of this kind of historical education is one, there are a lot of examples of people starting workshops with children, right? In terms of financial literacy. So that offers an opportunity, they're kind of thinking about sort of practical skills being learned as it relates to business, but that offers an opportunity to really sort of educate the public and particularly school children from that particular standpoint. The curriculum piece is much more challenging. As we know, there is a kind of attack on African-American history, right, with the critical race theory legislation. One of the things that I'm currently sort of involved in and is with a nonprofit organization called Bank Black USA. So if you go to bankblackusa.org, it is a nonprofit that is interested in educating from that particular standpoint. And so it really sort of provides, from a contemporary perspective, the resources of African-American banks in real time. It provides economic development or economic empowerment, points to economic development and empowerment opportunities. It is working with several universities across the country. But one of the things that they're lacking is that kind of historical piece. And so it kind of is a one-shop, a central location for African-Americans who want to expand their economic ideas and have some sense of where they can do that. But what they've been lacking is this kind of historical educational component that I'm trying to help support in this particular way. So that's kind of, those are some of the things that I'm doing in some of the ways that I think we can, as we think about and identify these entities that have these workshops. Black Enterprise Magazine has a regular conversations in these communities. These kinds of conversations are happening, and so it's important for us to sort of jump into those conversations. It's about sort of what's happening in a contemporary standpoint, but it's also important to remind the general public about the historical importance of Black business and Black enterprise, Black entrepreneurship. Thank you for that question.
Great, thank you. We have another from one of our attendees, Angelo Lowry. He says, I'm in the first generation Jamaican immigrant and was wondering if the diaspora from the Caribbean countries have contributed to the history of Black entrepreneurship and banking in America. Are there any standout examples that come to mind?
Wow, that's a really, really great question. I have to actually think about that a bit more. I'll tell you this. When we think about sort of Black banking, I'll use the Kings and Farmers Bank and the Citizens and Southern Bank and Trust Company that was in Philadelphia. During the 1930s, there were efforts by these African-American businesses. They made trips to Haiti, and they were interested in figuring out ways, and people like Charles Clinton Spalding, the president of North Carolina Mutual, were interested in figuring out ways to establish a stronger sort of economic relationship with countries like Haiti, are not as successful making these broader connections. In other words, these Black business institutions aren't able, and also they don't have the significant resources really to expand outside of the United States. All right, but there are these ongoing, especially you think about from a diasporic conversation, there are these attempts by African American business people to think about expanding and broadening their relationship to countries in the Caribbean. But it's a good question. I have to look a bit deeper into the extent to which some of the ways in which some of the immigrants to the United States from those areas were involved, particularly the way I understood the question, in helping to establish or having a good working relationship with African American banks. I have to look into that a little bit more. I don't really know necessarily the extent of that. But it's a good question. I'm going to write that down and make sure that I pursue that as part of my research.
Indeed, there's a new book. There we go. Potentially. My parents are Jamaican, so for me that's exciting.
I would point you to, sorry to interrupt you. I would point you to a book by James Peter Hudson. It's called Bankers and Empire. Well, where it doesn't necessarily look at African American banking institutions, but it looks at these larger banks in the United States and in the ways in which they kind of got an economic stronghold over the Caribbean, and it looks at really sort of global capitalism and colonialism. So that's one book that I can sort of point you to give you a broader sense of what was happening in that context. So that's something I can point to right there.
Thank you. Can you repeat the title of the book once more for people who didn't catch it?
Bankers and Empire. I forget the subtitle, but it's by James Peter Hudson. It's through the University of Chicago Press.
Great, thank you. But we have more questions. So this one's from Dr. Keith Hollingsworth from Morehouse. He asked, given what you've learned, what should we be asking? Well, what should we be teaching young Black entrepreneurs today?
Great question. What should we be teaching Black entrepreneurs today? Well, one of the things is that when we look at the history of Black banking institutions and we study the history of Black business, inevitably the things that comes up is this conversation about the failures of those institutions, right? And so in part, we get caught up on the conversations about their demise, so forth and so on. But we also have to remind those young Black entrepreneurs that many of those Black institutions are still around, but also I think part of that question is from a 21st century standpoint, we have to be able to identify Black institutions that are being innovative in terms of their products, innovative in terms of how they ensure their future. Like I always use the example of the Mechanics Farmers Bank. One of the things that they were able to do during COVID is they were able to kind of reassert their identity as this Black institution, while at the same time reminding business people that they were interested in those small business leaders and interested. And one of the things they also did was they trained and provided workshops for people who are interested in accessing CARE Act funds. They're also, I think the biggest challenge has been also the lack of access to capital. There are a lot of instances, I think we have to also point to instances where African Americans are helping to fund through startups, African American entrepreneurs. There's an African American woman who, and her name escapes me right now, who her primary mission of her company is to identify African American startups and to provide them with capital, right? Because one of the things that she found was in certain areas, people were more willing to dismiss and marginalize African American startups, even those who had really sound proposals, really sound experience in business, but came up short when it came to capital. So there are instances and examples that we can point them to, right, where people from a contemporary standpoint are looking toward the future in terms of entrepreneurship, right? And we can have this conversation about the history and the successes and failures, But we also have to have that conversation about the continuation of African-American business and to get them to think about how to really sort of be innovative in their own entrepreneurial ideas, right? It's kind of the conversation that we have to have. So it really has to be a kind of a pivot toward getting them to think about what's possible, right? Thinking about what's accessible from a contemporary standpoint, right? Pointing them to something like Bank Greenwood or the Greenwood Bank, which is this fintech company founded by Killer Mike and Ambassador Andrew Young, right? So these kinds of things that are really sort of taking place and happening. And so part of that education has to be, yes, the history and the successes and failures, but we also have many instances of where we can point them to things that are kind of happening and taking us and moving us forward is really, really important. Hopefully I answered that. Those are some of the things that kind of on my mind as relates to that question. And I'm always thinking about, right? Bank Black, buy Black from a 21st century perspective.
Thank you so much. Do you have time for one more quick question?
Oh yeah, sure.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. So can you share a bit about the formal business relationships between African-American business people and African firms during your time of study? Did anything come about with all of these travels? That it seemed a lot of travel between, across the ocean. So anything formalized as far as partnerships?
That's a good question. So, and I'll just say, frankly, from the standpoint of North Carolina Mutual and the Mechanics Farmers Bank, I don't have any evidence of when they're having these conversations. I don't have any evidence of there being a kind of expanded investment relationship, right? And I would say that part of, when I talk about African-American business abroad, part of outside of the United States, part of like how people in John Hervey Wheeler, they sort of bring a sense of what's happening in the United States using their own experiences, but by and large, they are compelled to embrace the United States' kind of foreign policy stance. In other words, they oftentimes are representing the United States, right? They're representing the Commerce Department. They're representing the United States in the State Department. And so from those particular examples, there isn't any evidence where they've been able to expand their enterprises. I use the example of R.R. Wright with the Southern Bank and Trust Company. He does start up a coffee company that's had some moderate success. And that's the critique also, right, of Black business people, these Black business people who are interested in establishing some broader relationships with throughout the diaspora. The critique is that their resources are too limited to have the kind of impact that these countries are interested in, right? And so that's kind of a critique. But when it comes to like the Mechanics Farmers Bank, the North Carolina Mutual, some of the other financial institutions, I don't have any evidence of where they were able to expand their investment interests outside of the United States, even as they're having conversations about it, right? And I don't know about people like John S. Johnson, perhaps. I don't know the extent to which he's able to do that, right? With Ebony and sort of this media conglomerate. I would say more broadly, the Black beauty culture industry, right, is something that really is able to sort of take off from a global standpoint. From a contemporary standpoint, there's a sort of assertion of that kind of relationship as it relates to the Black beauty culture industry. When it comes to like the financial institutions like banks and insurance companies, is very limited from that particular standpoint.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Winford. It's a very exciting talk. Thank you again for staying for our Q&A. This concludes today's event. Of course, a special thanks to the Keller Center and Princeton for continuing to support this series. It's been very enthusiastic, and that's appreciated and needed. So thank you everyone for attending. Wonderful questions. You kept Dr. Winford thinking hard. This is great. You gave him ideas for at least 2 new books. So he'll cut you some checks later. I'm joking about that. So again, for this semester, we have 1 more lecture. So please register and attend live if you can. And also look out for our event replays. So thank you again, Dr. Winford, and take care, everyone.
Thank you all so much.
Learn more about the history and legacy of Black entrepreneurship in the United States by visiting kellercenter.princeton.edu/Black entrepreneurship. Join us for future Keller Center events, which you can find at kellercenter.princeton.edu/events.